Hello, everyone. This is Lauren Remus. On behalf of America's Job Exchange, thank you for joining us today for Affirmative Action, Compliance for Recruiters. Before we get started, I do have a few notes. Please use the Q&A feature to submit your questions. We'll plan to address questions at the end of today's presentation as time permits. If we don't get to your question today, you will receive an answer via email. Please allow a few days for that response. And since we do get this question a lot, yes, we will be sending the slides and a link to the recording after the event. Also, after this event, a short survey will pop up. If you can take a minute to let us know what you thought of today's presentation, we greatly appreciate it. And now I'd like to introduce today's fantastic presenters. Joining us from Hudson Mann, a leader in affirmative action planning and compliance, are Alan Hudson, Chief Operating Officer, and Russell Rooney, Senior Compliance Specialist. Both Alan and Russell have extensive expertise in AAP development, audit support and training, and they've helped hundreds of employers keep their companies and their staff in compliance. Alan and Russell, thanks to you both for being here. I'll turn the presentation over to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Lauren, and thank you everyone for tuning in today. We're really excited to talk about this topic. It's one of the most common areas that we discuss as it relates to affirmative action compliance, and lots of ways where recruiters and talent acquisition professionals can really impact the success of their organization's D&I efforts, while at the same time decreasing liability from the affirmative action side of things. Really quickly, our agenda for today will be a bit of background. We're going to talk about the areas of common liability within an OFCCP audit. We'll talk about best practices along the way, and then hopefully at the end have time for some questions. So as Lauren said, please do submit those as we go. In 2019, 60% of OFCCP's cases that ended with financial remedies contained issues in the hiring process, making this the area of greatest potential liability for affirmative action employers. In this session, we're going to cover the 4 biggest compliant pitfalls and the role that you as recruiters play in preventing each of those. And those 4 areas are adverse impact in hiring, compensation and pay equity, outreach, and record keeping. We hope you'll learn some practical tips to decrease that liability, again, while increasing the diversity of your talent pool. So a little bit of background, just so you know, and in case you're not very familiar with affirmative action plans or with the OFCCP, there's a long history of laws and regulations in our country leading up to this conversation we're having today. We've included this slide not to have a labor law class, we're not attorneys, but we do want to give you an idea of the laws that are affecting and protecting workers in the United States. Particularly, we're here because of Executive Order 11246, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and the Vietnam-era Veterans Readjustment and Assistance Act, each of which require affirmative action programs for federal contractors and subcontractors. So to start off, let's make sure we know what affirmative action is and what it's not. At its core, affirmative action is a commitment on the part of your company to take good faith efforts to ensure that there are no barriers to employment for women or minorities, and expanded upon that, also veterans and individuals with disabilities. Affirmative action is not a quota system, so that is a common misconception. Nor is it a requirement to hire, promote, transfer, mentor anyone who is not qualified for a position. Those are some of the stereotypes around affirmative action that just simply aren't true. So we always like to dispel those myths as much as we can. Executive Order 11246 that we initially mentioned was signed in 1965 by President Lyndon Johnson. And it was no longer enough to say that as a federal contractor, you just wouldn't discriminate. It now needed to be in writing if you met certain criteria and wanted to do business with the federal government. You can see here that those thresholds are 50 employees and $50,000 or more in a federal contract or subcontract. You'll notice the areas which are agreeing to not discriminate include race, color, religion, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, and national origin. And by the way, there could be additional areas included based on your company's EEO policy or relevant state and local regulations. So again, to give a little bit of background on the scope of who is covered by these affirmative action regulations, we want to take a look at the definition of being a contractor or a subcontractor. And we're going to take a look at a sample business. Let's say you're in the refinery business and you sell your product to a manufacturer of tires. And those tires then go into a vehicle, and that vehicle gets sold to the US military or the US government as part of a federal contractor. What we want to do is follow the money. So assuming each of these businesses have 50 employees or more, and that this car or defense vehicle costs more than $50,000, as many or most of them do, that first contractor who sells the car directly to the federal government, they're required to have a written affirmative action plan. The company that creates the tires that go on the vehicle would be required to have a written affirmative action plan. And then, of course, the refinery company that makes the raw materials that go into those pieces and components would also be required to have an affirmative action plan. So why should you be an affirmative action employer? Of course, first of all, it's the law if you are doing business with the federal government. We also believe your AAP can be an effective managerial tool. The reports give you a really good understanding and analysis of your diversity efforts. They help you recognize any barriers to employment, and they also help you to evaluate equity in your personnel processes, including hiring, termination, promotion, training, pay, recall, whatever that may be. Now, affirmative action is primarily enforced by the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, or OFCCP. They're related to the EEOC, which you may be familiar with, but a little different because they focus primarily on federal contractors and subcontractors, and they are really that police arm branch of the Department of Labor. And this is the agency that can audit your company in a very, very detailed and time-consuming method if you are selected for an audit. And OFCCP's enforcement jurisdiction, again, covers those three main laws: Executive Order 11246, the Vietnam-Era Veterans Readjustment Assistance Act, or VEVRA, and Section 503 of the Rehabilitation Act, which requires affirmative action programs for individuals with disabilities. So as we talk about OFCCP audits, we've laid a little bit of groundwork of who they are, the laws that they enforce. We want to give you a little bit of an update of the current audit environment. What you will notice is over the past 13 years or so, based on OFCCP's enforcement database, the number of audits they conduct by year is changing. It started to really dip in 2014. There were a few things that happened in that year. There were new regulations for veterans and individuals with disabilities, which we will be discussing in our outreach and documentation sections of this. And the OFCCP began to focus more on the quality, as they would say, of audits rather than the number of audits they conducted. And pay investigations became a lot more prevalent and in-depth. So all of those things conspired to create multi-years of reduced numbers of OFCCP audits, but you will see that trend has started to reverse. So under the current OFCCP administration and leadership, they're really working to streamline how they conduct compliance reviews or audits, and the number of audits they've conducted has gone up from a low in 2018 to fiscal year 2019, 1,331 audits. And so far in fiscal year 2020, they have already completed 808 compliance evaluations, again, based on their enforcement database. Now, some of you may be on this call because your facility or your company received an audit scheduling letter sometime recently, or you were added to what we call the CSAL list in March of 2019. That list has also been augmented as of November of 2019 with 500 additional VEVRA or veterans focused reviews. Again, to break that down in a little bit of context, most of those reviews, 2,300, are standard OFCCP audits where they look at all 3 affirmative action programs and everything that goes into them. 500 were Section 503 focused reviews, focusing on your AAPs for individuals with disabilities. We had 500 compliance checks, which were really short, abbreviated audits, just to make sure that you have an AAP on file. Also audits for corporate management compliance evaluations to look at an entire organization, and functional affirmative action programs for those contractors that have functional AAP agreements with the OFCCP. You're more likely to be audited if your establishment is larger. Again, no company is going to get audited at more than 15 different establishments during the same year. No more than 2 functional AAPs should be selected for audit from the same company within a given year. And they haven't included some establishments that had been and closed out their reviews within the last 2 years. And that's just a typical OFCCP approach there. We have seen release 1 language again in that initial scheduling. Again, we had the 500 VEVRA audits added in November of 2019. And from what we're seeing on a day-to-day basis here at Hudson Man, the number of audits and the pace of scheduling has actually increased since earlier this year. OFCCP is being very lenient in granting extensions, especially because they know all employers, and some in particular, have really been hit hard by the coronavirus COVID-19 pandemic. So if you are selected for an audit, know that OFCCP has some additional time and resources available to you. But don't be surprised if you've been on that CSAL list and haven't gotten a letter recently. Pay attention to your inbox now, as they are looking to schedule those electronically, since most employers are still not back to where they're checking for certified mail or staffing that part of their establishments on a regular basis. So that's the number of audits they're doing. That's the process. They're looking to increase the number of audits they can complete each year under the current administration. And in 2019, OFCCP had a huge year in financial remedies. Now note that monetary relief from the OFCCP is not a fine to your organization. It is typically either the loss of a lawsuit where OFCCP has alleged discrimination, or a settlement between a company and the OFCCP, and that money goes to victims or alleged victims of discrimination. You're not fined just for being out of compliance or not having AAP, but you do have that liability if there is discrimination or barriers to employment within your organization. So $40.5 million, that's a lot of money. If we break down the kinds of violations the OFCCP sees, you will see that at the top of the list, looking back over the last 8 fiscal years, recruitment is #1 on the list, followed by record keeping. And then you get into past performance and written AAP, which is where typically a contractor who has been required to do some remedial work may have fallen short of what they were required to do, or just did not have an AAP to begin with. But again, recruitment and record keeping are super high on the list and perfectly tailored to what the rest of our webinar will be about as we begin to discuss the greatest areas of liability for your organization. And those 4 areas, which we will explore in depth, are adverse impact in the hiring process, pay equity, so compensation systems and fair pay are really in the spotlight. Outreach, of course, America's Job Exchange is a great partner for this. So your required and voluntary outreach efforts are both needed. And of course, all of this has to be done under the umbrella of really good record retention and supporting documentation. I'm now going to hand over the next session as we dive into adverse impact to my colleague, Russell Rooney. Russell.
Thanks, Alan. So as Alan said previously, the majority of OFCCP's financial remedies come from cases involving discrimination in the hiring process. These are all based on findings of disparities in hiring selection through adverse impact analysis. So we'll look at some samples, some sample analysis to kind of give you some background. When the OFCCP receives a company's audit data, they will conduct an adverse impact analysis like the one shown here. Adverse impact is a statistical indication of potential discrimination. It occurs when the rate of selection for one group is less than 80% of the selection rate of another group. Adverse impact is determined by a four-step process. In this simple example, first you'll calculate the rate of selection for each group, divide the number of persons selected from a group by the number of applicants from that group. Here you'll see 50 white hires divided by 100 white applicants, which equals a 50% hire rate. There are 50 minority applicants and 10 minority hires, which equal a 20% hire rate. Second, you'll observe which group has the highest selection rate. In this case, the white applicants have a higher selection rate. Third, you'll calculate the impact ratios by dividing the selection rate for each group by that of the highest group. So here we'll divide the 20% minority hire rate by the 50% white hire rate. This results in an impact ratio of 40% for minority applicants. Fourth, and finally, we observe whether the selection rate for any group is substantially less than the selection rate of the highest group, usually less than 4/5 or 80%. If it is substantially less, adverse impact is indicated in most circumstances. Here, 40% is less than 80%, so adverse impact is probably indicated. You'll see that the number of applicants is a crucial piece of this calculation. That said, not everyone who applies to a position will meet the OFCCP's definition of an internet applicant. Having an understanding of that definition is a key way recruiters can help ensure compliance in their organization. So now we need to talk about the definition of an internet applicant, but before we dive into that, we need to define some terms. Primarily, you'll be hearing me use the terms candidate and applicant. These terms are not interchangeable. A job seeker and a candidate may be used interchangeably, but there are differences there as well. So a job seeker is essentially an individual who is seeking employment. A candidate is an individual that has applied to a specific position, but has not yet met the definition of an applicant. So through the process, you'll be hearing me use the term candidate primarily. Job seeker and candidate are again used interchangeably quite often, but they're distinctly different than an applicant. So an applicant is an individual that has applied to a specific position and has met all four criteria of the definition of an applicant. Those are the only individuals that should be counted in your adverse impact analysis. So let's discuss the definition of an internet applicant. For the sake of time, we'll assume that you're using some type of applicant tracking system, or at least accepting resumes and applications through electronic means. So only those job seekers who meet all four criteria are considered internet applicants, and only those should be included in the analysis. So the first criteria is that an individual submits an expression of interest in employment via the internet or related technology. Now, language in this definition is very important. You'll notice it does not say submits an application. Rather, it says an expression of interest via internet or related technology. Those technologies may include email, internet, third-party resumes, job banks, electronic scanning technology, applicant tracking systems, applicant service providers, applicant screeners, so on and so forth. As well, the candidate must apply through whatever means you have designated. So if you indicate on the posting that they must apply to your website and they go through any other means, you don't have any record retention requirements for that. They have not followed the process, so you do not even consider them a candidate at that time. Criteria number 2, the contractor considers the individual for employment in a particular position. Now at this point, there is a 2-year record retention requirement. And Alan, we can't see that one up on the screen yet. There we go. At this point, there is a mandatory 2-year record retention requirement. Due to Section 503 and VEVRA, we highly recommend that you keep those records for 3 years. Now, your consideration at this point is simply reviewing the individual's expression of interest. Do you see the name in your internal database or your external search? You click on the link, you've considered that candidate. So at this point, if they don't appear to be viable, you can set up a no-go folder for your records and move it there. You should be retaining these records in some retrievable format. Typically, they're not going to be measured in the adverse impact analysis, but in the event of an audit, the OFCCP can request to view your candidates for record retention. The other important word in this statement is particular. This means the candidate must apply to a specific opening. So you should not consider candidates for any position or consider candidates for multiple positions. The only time you should consider candidates for multiple positions is if they apply for multiple positions. Criteria number 3, the submission indicates the individual possesses the basic qualifications for the position. Now, these must be established in advance, non-comparative, objective, and relevant. So well-written job descriptions are critical. Qualifications first must be established in advance, which means you can't just make them up as you go along. You can't have a position for a truck driver with one specific job posting and another truck driver with a different one. They have to be the same. They must be non-comparative. So an example of that is to say 3 years of experience instead of top 5 in years of experience. Qualifications must be objective. So saying a bachelor's in accounting, not something vague like a technical degree. Lastly, they must be relevant to the performance of the position and enable the contractor to accomplish business-related goals. Criteria number 4, the job seeker did not later indicate a lack of interest in the job for which he or she was considered. Basically, if the candidate shows a lack of interest or removes themselves from consideration at any point throughout the process, for example, they need 50K, you're only offering 30K, they've removed themselves from the process. You need them in Dallas, they can't leave Houston, they've removed themselves from consideration. These can happen at any point throughout the process. And it can happen for a number of reasons. So only when the candidate meets all 4 of these criteria will they be considered an applicant, and so at this time they should be included in your adverse impact analysis. So that brings us to our first key takeaway. To ensure accuracy of your adverse impact analysis and manage the flow of applicants, disposition codes and statuses are the best way to help apply the definition of an applicant to your job seekers. This will keep you from artificially inflating the number of applicants in your reports and will also help pinpoint issues as they occur. Those who prepare your AAPs will typically rely heavily on disposition codes when assessing your hiring activity. Disposition codes are also the first line of defense in any OFCCP inquiries into potential hiring discrimination. Always ensure that you're using the most relevant disposition code for each candidate you review. So here are some sample disposition codes and how they apply to the definition of an internet applicant. One we see frequently overused are codes like more experienced applicant hired. While this is likely the best disposition for some candidates, it shouldn't apply to all job seekers that weren't chosen if there's a more accurate disposition available. This is even more important when a different disposition code would indicate someone did not meet the definition of an internet applicant. That way we could remove them and they wouldn't inflate your numbers. So dispositions should be as specific as possible and ideally pinpoint where in the process they were eliminated. So in order to determine where in the process a candidate was eliminated, first you need to define your process. Federal contractors are required to have a written, formalized applicant process that's followed consistently. There's no law that says what this process has to be. It's going to be based on your capabilities and the nature of your business primarily. It may vary depending on level. So the process for hiring a director is going to be different than hiring a warehouse worker, but they can fit into a kind of overall general hiring policy for the company. The applicant process should be broken into steps, and step-specific dispositioning should be used to help identify which step in the process a candidate was eliminated. So here we have an example of a written applicant process. Having your process in writing protects your company in an audit. Ensuring that the process is followed consistently is the best way for a company to minimize its liability. There are different methods to putting this in writing, flow charts. On the next slide, you'll see kind of an Excel spreadsheet laying out the steps. A lot of times when you're in an audit, the auditors will interview managers and they'll ask them very open-ended questions like, what is your hiring process? And they're going to give, nobody's going to give the same answer. And your only defense to say what our process is to ensure you have it in writing. So once you have your process broken out into steps, you can start assigning step-specific dispositions. The initial steps of the process will be solely focused on basic qualifications, comparing the candidate's resume to the bona fide job qualifications outlined in the posting. At this step, you'll be using dispositions directly related to that comparison. For example, candidate does not meet minimum qualifications, education. Candidate does not meet minimum qualifications, experience. Once you get to the later stages of the process, you're more times than not find yourself with a similarly qualified pool of candidates. Only at this time should you allow recruiters to use dispositions like better qualified candidate hired. That is a later stage disposition. Best practice to consider at the later stage is not to say why you didn't hire a candidate, especially because there may not be a business reasoning other than somebody else was more qualified. That person could have been immensely qualified for the position. Rather, you want to use a disposition indicating why you hired somebody else. For example, better candidate hired relevance. In this disposition, it tells you that the candidate was indeed qualified, but the person that was hired had experience that was more directly related to the role or possibly industry specific. So it helps narrow down where in the process you would know this is a later stage disposition, and it would tell you a specific reason, which you will have to provide if the OFCCP is analyzing your pools in detail. So ways to avoid hiring discrimination. First off, solid job descriptions. Again, make sure these are established in advance. You are also obligated to review your job descriptions annually or minimally at least when new jobs come available. Be consistent in your hiring processes. Inconsistencies in the hiring process means that you are treating some differently than others, which can and will be viewed as discriminatory by the OFCCP. Next, use disposition codes to eliminate non-applicants from your applicant logs. This will avoid artificially inflating those logs. The greater the numbers, the greater the chance for adverse impacts. So we want to minimize the applicant counts as much as we can. Run adverse impact analysis annually and investigate areas where you see a statistical indication of potential discriminatory activity. Finally, ensure all tests and assessments have been validated. So now we'll move on to compensation and pay equity, and Alan will pick it up from there.
Great, thank you, Russell. So the next big area of liability is compensation and pay equity. So if we look at fiscal year 2019, of all the cases that had financial remedies, 37% of those cases included compensation violations or compensation discrimination, or at least alleged compensation discrimination. So here you can see that if you can get your applicant processes compliant and non-discriminatory, and you're ensuring fair pay and pay equity, in fiscal year 2019, you would have eliminated approximately 97% of your liability financial liability as it pertains to an OFCCP audit. Of course, you won't have really any awareness of that if you're not continually updating your AAPs on an annual basis. So as we look at compensation, we want to have recruiters be particularly aware of the role that they play in compensation decisions and making offers. This is especially true since this is an area of liability that is on the rise. OFCCP is spending more and more time focused on this area of potential discrimination. And while recruiters might not necessarily be the final decision makers on compensation levels for new hires, you still certainly have a part to play in ensuring fair and equitable pay. One principle to keep in mind is that pay equity truly starts with starting pay. If there are disparities in starting pay for individuals in the same jobs, those disparities tend to grow with time and not shrink. You should really understand your company's starting pay policies and partner with your HR and compensation teams, as well as your hiring managers, to appropriately handle any discussions or negotiations around pay with potential employees, which really brings us to our first key takeaway, our next key takeaway, which is coordinating with HR on starting pay. Again, to ensure fair pay, one big place to start is getting starting pay levels right. Of course, there can be differences in pay based on bona fide occupational qualifications, but you really want to ensure those are objective in nature and well documented. Job steering is another area where compensation discrimination can intersect with hiring discrimination. And it's really important, again, to be aware of how that happens in a recruiting process. So to define job steering, it's really the practice of steering employees who are members of a protected class towards lower paying jobs at the time of hire. And that can really result from explicit bias or implicit bias based on stereotypes. The appearance of job steering can even emerge when a non-discriminatory hiring process is just not well documented. So we're going to take a look at one case study from a few years ago. This was a $1.8 million job steering settlement in fiscal year 2015 from the OFCCP. And in that case, which spanned multiple establishments, so 9 different establishments with similar hiring patterns, OFCCP found that 444 women were steered into light duty jobs, which had lower wages than heavy duty jobs. And I'm using air quotes, I know you can't see me here. That constituted pay discrimination because it appeared that women were being steered towards lower paying jobs based on the stereotypes about what constituted women's work versus men's work. Of course, OFCCP sees no difference between those two, nor do we at Hudson Man, but it looked like discrimination was occurring there. On top of that perceived discrimination against women, there was also adverse impact in hiring against males and African Americans and Caucasians because those groups were being selected less frequently for the light duty jobs. Again, OFCCP was able to expand this and find similar patterns within the same contractor scenario. So how do we avoid steering issues like this? And that takes us to key takeaway number 3. Require applications for specific positions. This will help ensure that job seekers are being considered for the jobs they want, as opposed to the jobs that someone, a hiring manager, a recruiter, a manager thinks may be best for that person, whether that is based on a hunch or implicit bias or something other than the valid business criteria for making an employment selection. It's also much more difficult for federal agencies to allege discrimination when you can document each job seeker's desired position. If push comes to shove, it's much simpler to explain why you didn't hire someone for one job than it is to explain why you didn't hire that person for any job. It's worth noting that in this particular case, it was a settlement with OFCCP. I've heard of representatives from that company alleging that in every case, someone chose which job they wanted to. There was no steering occurring by the company. Individuals got to see what the heavy duty jobs and the light duty jobs were like, and they were selecting those accordingly to their work preferences. However, it was not well documented. And that can put you in a lot of potential liability. With that, we're going to change gears now that you've been able to hopefully find the areas where you can reduce 97% of your financial liability, and talk about the areas where you still have additional liability from a violations and compliance standpoint. And that next area is outreach. And I'm going to turn presentation back over to Russell to cover outreach.
Thanks, Alan. So it is critical for recruiters to know where your company has goals for women, minorities, veterans, and individuals with disabilities. As you recall, there are no quotas in your AAPs. So your goals for women and minorities are based on national and local census data for your company's external areas and internal feeder groups. Recruiters need to be aware of each establishment or AAP location's specific goals for women and minorities. I'm sure you all know by now that Uncle Sam has established a 7% hiring goal for individuals with disabilities for all contractors. You should also be aware of the hiring benchmark set for veterans, which is now currently at 5.7%. This number has gone down from the initial, I believe it was 6.7%, because a lot of veterans have found employment. So we'll see what that number's at after the whole COVID crisis passes, but it has gone down every time it's been released so far. So I hope that you know that you are required to post all your open non-executive positions with the state in which you are headquartered or where the plan is located. This map can get you to the appropriate state employment service delivery system, also known as your employment security office. When you know your goals, you can begin making specific targeted outreach. You might find nearby colleges and professional organizations for qualified women and minority candidates. You might partner with local veterans groups and organizations that can help locate qualified individuals with disabilities. Outreach efforts for women and minorities must be targeted and must be meaningful. Targeted in the sense that you're reaching out to female or minority-oriented organizations when you have a goal and the job group and opening is associated with. The meaningful part can be a little bit more difficult. You should be reaching out to organizations that will yield you qualified candidates for the position. For example, if you're looking for an engineer, reaching out to a high school isn't going to be meaningful because nobody will be qualified. Outreach for individuals with disabilities and veterans should be done across the board for all positions. So it's great if you're doing your outreach, but it's not enough to say you're not discriminating and that you're making good faith outreach efforts. You must actually assess the effectiveness of that outreach. Make sure you're keeping records of outreach activities. It can be used in a spreadsheet to track those activities like you see here. There are other methods. You can have a specific system that allows recruiters to see your goals and your actual real-time outreach progress. This is a look at Hudson Man's good faith effort portal, but any method of tracking should do as long as you're able to produce documentation upon request. The key takeaway here to know is where your companies have goals. However you're handling it, ensure that the mandatory job listings are occurring. Document specific targeted outreach towards women, minorities, veterans, and individuals with disabilities. Finding outreach resources in your local areas may be difficult. So thankfully, there are some sources available to help you get started. The OFCCP has developed an employment referral directory that lists governmental and non-governmental organizations to assist in hiring of qualified applicants by federal contractors. You can access the site at the link shown here. OFCCP also has a team of regional outreach coordinators, or ROCs, who are available to federal contractors to keep them informed of outreach events in your area. They're even supposed to assist with putting together an outreach plan in some circumstances. So you can find your local ROC at the link included on the Department of Labor's website. Another wonderful resource, as I'm sure you're all aware since you're here, is America's Job Exchange. Some low-hanging fruit you may want to utilize are your employees themselves. Find out what organizations they're members of. Be sure to keep the documentation for all outreach activities, and you will be required to produce this information in the event of an OFCCP audit. So now we will look at record keeping, and I will throw it back to Alan.
Thank you, Russell. And again, thank you, America's Job Exchange, for the opportunity to present this webinar. Your outreach tools have been of considerable use and utility during many audits, and certainly a wonderful resource, as Russell said there. So the final area we're going to look at is record keeping. Similar to outreach violations, money isn't typically on the line here for record keeping violations, unless there is some underlying discriminatory action occurring, but conciliation reporting can be an administrative nightmare, and you don't want to be required to report to OFCCP on a 6-month or annual basis if you don't have to. These long reporting cycles ideally can be avoided by good record keeping. You must, at a minimum, maintain 3 years of employment and recruiting data and documentation. This includes your applicant flow logs, applications, and hiring manager notes. And if you are in an OFCCP audit, you will need to keep all of those records even longer. I would typically recommend, at a minimum, you're required by law to keep all those documents relevant to an audit, to maintain them for the duration of that audit, which sometimes can be years in the making. You may want to check with your internal or external counsel to talk about your company's specific record keeping and record retention guidelines. But anything related to the hiring process, the more documentation, the better. Some common shortfalls, again, that we have seen in companies during the audit process: mandatory job listings. That's a huge one. Again, partnering with America's Job Exchange is a really great way of automating that mandatory job listing process. Applicant flow records. If you have a 1-to-1 applicant to hire ratio in your affirmative action program as it's submitted for an audit, that is going to virtually be an immediate red flag for the OFCCP. Unfortunately, I do think it is worth noting that during this COVID-19 pandemic, when many organizations have instituted hiring freezes, layoffs, and furloughs, it's important to keep documentation of that, as well as many companies, the amount of hiring they do in 2020 may be significantly different than what it has been in prior years. And in the past economic recessions, we've seen cases where no hiring occurred during a year, or one employee was recalled, and so it looked like a 1-to-1 applicant to hire ratio. Keeping documentation of all of that is really critical, especially when your practices are impacted significantly by external events. Problem areas and action-oriented programs, and this can kind of be a little bit of a Bermuda Triangle within an AAP. If you have a problem with your affirmative action program and you haven't documented it, and you haven't instituted any or action-oriented programs, OFCCP can say or allege that you have both failed to find a problem area and failed to execute an action-oriented program, and that can kind of become a circular pattern that's hard to get out of. So really documenting any problem areas that you find in the AP and addressing those prior to the submission of an audit. Highly recommended. Also, outreach evaluations for VEVRA and Section 503. And we'll talk about these here for a couple of minutes because we have seen an uptick in the amount of focus OFCCP has put around these analyses. So since 2014, federal contractors are required to conduct and document an annual assessment of effectiveness of their outreach for both veterans and individuals with disabilities. And these reports require you to state whether the totality of your outreach efforts were successful or not. And if those outreach efforts were not successful, you also need to say what your plan of action for the next year will be. In recent audits, we've seen even more emphasis that you have an evaluation of each outreach effort. Again, this is where tools like America's Job Exchange compliance reports can really help. You can get that list of outreach sources where your jobs were distributed and annotate that based on how effective each outreach effort was in terms of whether it be getting new hires that were veterans or individuals with disabilities, or simply increasing the number of applicants and job seekers who were individuals with disabilities and veterans along with that. Really important to have that, especially if you're going into a focused Section 503 review or a focused VEVRA review. But we've also seen in recent establishment reviews, and this is something that did not really happen frequently in the last 6 years, but has really started to be more of a trend this year, is looking for 3 years worth of these evaluations kept on file. That is the regulation. It's been on the books since 2014. OFCCP is asking for it a lot more frequently now than they had been up until 2020. So the key takeaway for this section, of course, is documentation, documentation, and documentation. We often kind of joke about this, but you can see it truly is important, and it funnels through from everything from your selection process, your pay decisions, and your outreach efforts. The more documentation you have, the better. It's generally understood that in the absence of documentation, you will be found in violation of some regulation or potentially alleged to be discriminating in one of your employment or selection processes. So how do you minimize some potential liability? We'll go through this final list of some best practices here for you before we go into Q&A. Of course, as Russell had said, follow a formal application process and ensure that it's consistent. Next, you want to use disposition codes. As discussed earlier, those dispositions are really going to be your first line of defense in explaining why any candidate was not chosen for a job. If you can, avoid informal expressions of interest. In other words, don't allow anyone to slip into work for your company without following your predefined process for that particular position. Set up active consideration periods. And we've seen a lot of changes in philosophies within our client base around this. But there's no rule that says you have to review everyone who applied for a specific job. There's no rule that says you have to have your positions posted for some particular period of time outside of those rules that your state workforce agencies may have. If you can get all the candidates you need by opening up a posting for one day and turning it off, do that. Certainly that's a way to help you manage the volume of applicants. Again, every time you review an application or a submission of interest, you're required to keep that for 2 years. So if you look at fewer, that's less record keeping obligation. Lots of different ways to manage that. We also recommend not accepting applications for quote unquote any opening. As you can imagine, again, it's hard to show what the qualifications are and did the candidate meet any of them for any opening. All expressions of interest should be towards specific positions, even if that means applicants can apply to multiple jobs. That is a better way to track that. Make sure that you post any temp to hire opportunities. List those with the state workforce agencies is what we would say. Although you might not have gotten any new employees in that temp to hire or temp to perm transition, the OFCCP still expects that any filled positions will have had the required state agency listing. Watch out for your employee referral selection processes as well. What we find, what the EOC and OFCCP have both commented on, is that employee referrals can often look just like the employees. So if there's not a lot of diversity in your current employment population, employee referral procedures may not help increase the diversity of that. You certainly wouldn't want that to be your only channel if it is not helping you meet your affirmative action goals. Make sure you set and use minimum qualifications. Of course, that's super important. And finally, make sure that any pre-employment tests you use have been properly validated to ensure that there is no adverse impact on any group. As Russell had indicated earlier, if there's adverse impact in the selection process, and if that's the result of any assessment or test, you need to ensure that that test is valid, as in truly predictive of what it's testing for, if it's creating an adverse impact by race or gender. And if it's not predicting job success or qualification in some way, and it's impacting by race and gender, you need to get rid of that test. Or if you're not sure if it's having an impact, it's worth doing the validation studies to find that out. Again, that's where we would recommend talking with counsel or consultants to help you in ensuring that you're utilizing tests and assessments in an appropriate manner. So with that said, that represents the body of what we wanted to cover. Again, hitting those 4 key areas where you have liability as recruiters in affirmative action compliance. And now, Lauren, we can open it up back to you and any questions.
Thanks, Alan and Russell. We actually did get quite a few come in. I'm going to take them in the order they came in. So let's just hit it. Starting with the hiring process. We had a question around the best way to handle a situation in which you want to consider a candidate for multiple job openings. How would you track that?
So there are a few different ways, but typically you would want them, and in particular, if the job descriptions are different enough to deem multiple positions, you'd want to have them apply to each and be compared to the individual pools of applicants for those positions. If you have multiple openings, say for the same position, then that's fine if you've advertised it. But if you're talking different roles with different skill sets, they would need individual submissions of interest for those different skill sets to be compared to the individual pools.
Okay, great. We have another couple of questions coming around a new LinkedIn offering, a new option that allows for screening questions drafted by the company that can then be used at the stage of expressing interest within LinkedIn. Are you guys familiar with this?
Not with LinkedIn specifically, but with screening questions, you always want to make sure that the screening questions, and this is kind of dangerous territory a lot of times, you want to make sure they're directly related to the outlined bona fide job criteria. So, and questions for different roles are going to be different. So if you're sticking to those bona fide qualifications, things like, are you authorized to work in the United States, stuff like that, that's fine. But I wouldn't go too in depth in the questioning, because you can get yourself into a lot of trouble doing that.
And I would add as well, from the social media aspect and sourcing through LinkedIn or other online job boards, a big part of that from a record keeping standpoint is if they've expressed interest in the job, that's really easy to do. You can do that formally, informally. So that's super easy to meet that first criteria. It's super easy to consider someone for employment as you're scrolling through LinkedIn or using their tools. The next step is, what is your selection process? Does it continue to be formal in a way that someone has to apply via your company's applicant tracking system, or would you potentially hire someone, would they move from being a candidate on LinkedIn to the phone screen and interview process, potentially through offer and hire, without having hit some other system? If that's true, I would be really concerned about what the record keeping at the LinkedIn stage would be like. That said, if there's a step that says, we see that you're interested for this job, and if you would like to be considered for it, please apply. That's a good safeguard. It's not foolproof, as it were, but it's a good safeguard, because if someone chooses not to apply or take that next step in your process, they have removed themselves from consideration, and then they're not an applicant. They don't need to be on your applicant flow log or within your AAP.
So a related question that we received was about, keeping a spreadsheet listing every single person that they're reaching out to via message. Is that a similar process where you'd want to be documenting it, every single message?
Well, it's going to depend on where you start that formalized process, and there's a difference between, say, sourcing for a position. That's a completely different log, where you're just kind of extending feelers to see, to gauge interest of individuals. And when you draw that line to say, okay, now the process actually begins. So it's very much going to depend on where that line is drawn.
Great. We had a question around, again, going back to hiring process. How do you disposition someone who's overqualified?
Great question. So a little history on that. Dispositions like overqualified became an issue back some years ago, around 2010, 2009, 2010, when the economy took very much of a downturn. You had a lot of people out of work that were looking for work that they were overqualified for, or had been paid substantially greater sums. Now, the term overqualified in and of itself means that you are qualified. So to avoid this, you would like to put some type of cap in the job description. So for example, say a minimum of 3, but no more than 5 years of experience. Something to that effect. There is something called willing and able. So if someone is overqualified and they are willing to take that position and they are able to do so, then you cannot dismiss them based on being overqualified. That is, unless you define what overqualified is.
Kind of related to that, someone was asking, does that feel a little bit like age discrimination once we get into that?
The two go hand in hand. Yes, they do.
Yeah. Okay.
Absolutely. The more defined and specific that can be, the better. But as Russell said, the term overqualified is not one that readily computes with OFCCP. And so don't expect to rely on that too much with much success in an audit.
Yeah. And also with that willing and able clause, I guess you could call it, it extends to things like travel. So say you have a position in one particular city or town, and somebody applies that has an address that's, say 2 hours away. You don't know if that individual, is planning on moving, if they have an old address. So willing and able, you would have to know, are you willing to relocate? Are you planning on relocating? Things of that nature to that as well. It also extends to pay. So if you haven't advertised your pay for a position, you can't assume that somebody will not take what you're willing to pay unless you've offered it to them. So if they're coming off a position making $80,000 a year, you can't just assume they won't take 50. You have to ask them, or at least make it known to them.
Okay, we have a couple questions about employee referrals, so I'd like to just end on these. when an employee referral program is not position specific, they go into a resume pool, or when we're sourcing, from our employee referrals, how do we handle that? And I know the answer is carefully. How do we handle that to ensure that we're in compliance?
Sure. So employee referrals do take some preference or are given some preference in the eyes of the OFCCP. Again, it's going to depend on where you draw that line to start the formalized process. So you can give preference, but ultimately you're going to hire the most qualified. If it comes down to 2 individuals or 3 individuals that have the same qualifications, one's an employee referral, then that could elevate them over other employees, and that's fine.
Great.
And I think,
Well, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and I think the only other thing I would add is, again, if there's a pool of employee referrals, you want them to apply to a specific position and route them through a formal process.
Well, we still have some more questions, gentlemen, but I would love to be able to get back to some of our Q&A askers via email, just so that we can have everyone get on with the rest of their day. Thank you both so much, and thank you to Hudson Mann for today's expert perspectives on OFCCP compliance. I'd like to thank everyone for attending. We hope to have you join us again for another America's Job Exchange webinar in the future. This concludes today's event. Have a great rest of your day.